Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Chris McCauley, Benefits Attorney for ProBenefits. Today is our first presentation in our 2016 client webinar series. It'll be a short 15-minute webinar on employee leaves of absence and benefit elections. The second session in our client webinar series is going to be an update on HSAs, health savings accounts, and that's going to be February 16th. As always, a copy of the slides and a recording will be provided to everyone following the live presentation by email in the next day or so. A quick outline of today's presentation. First, we're going to talk about continuation of benefits during leave. Then we're going to move on to how premiums are paid during leave, and then finally talk about other considerations and best practices. Just as an intro, before the session, obviously leaves of absence and all the scenarios surrounding leaves of absences could take up a lot of time. To be honest, 15 minutes is not enough to talk through every scenario about why someone goes on a leave of absence, when, and for how long. So that's really not the purpose of today's presentation. What we want to do today is essentially get back to the basics, talk about a general framework and the guidelines for addressing most leaves of absences, and just take a big picture look in 15 minutes to give everyone a general idea of the best way to treat leaves of absences and benefits during those leaves. So with that being said, I think the first thing we want to talk about is first we need to decide, are benefits going to continue during leave, or are benefits going to terminate for the employee that decides to take leave? So the first thing we want to do is first determine what type of leave is the employee going on, FMLA or non-FMLA leave. And first we want to determine, is the employee going on FMLA leave? Not all employees are eligible for FMLA leave. Generally, to be eligible for FMLA leave, an employee needs to work for an employer that has 50 or more employees, and also the employee has to meet some specific service requirements in order to be eligible for FMLA leave. If they are in fact eligible for FMLA leave, then the employee must be allowed to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid job protective leave each year to care for themselves or a family member who has a serious health condition. And so if we do in fact determine that the individual is eligible for FMLA leave and is going on leave for that particular purpose, then we know that the employer must offer group health plans at the same level and on the same conditions as prior to leave. So the employer must not only allow the employee to continue benefits, but the employer must also contribute the same amount that they've been contributing while the employee has been active. If they pay 100% of the premiums for medical coverage, they have to do the same thing while the individual is on FMLA leave. So that's the first step, is determining whether the employer has to offer continuation of coverage. But just because they offer continuation of coverage doesn't mean the employee is required to actually continue coverage. Generally, the start of leave is a Section 125 qualifying event. So the employee, even though they have the right to continue coverage, generally can choose to declare a Section 125 status change and revoke coverage upon the start of leave. So the employer for FMLA leave is required to offer coverage, but the employee generally is not required to continue that coverage. I say generally because the rules do allow the employer to require the employee to continue coverage during FMLA leave, but if that's the case, the employer must pay the premiums during leave. They can't require the employee to pay the premiums if they are requiring the employee to keep coverage. And for obvious reasons, that's not a common scenario. Employers generally don't want to have to pay the employee's portion during leave, so they give the employee the option to continue coverage during FMLA leave or allow the employee to drop coverage. So that's the basic framework for FMLA leave. Generally, all other leave is non-FMLA leave, and there's significant overlap between FMLA leave disability leave, workers' compensation leave, but generally for continuation of benefits purposes, we can list all the leaves or we can categorize all the leaves as FMLA or non-FMLA leave. So the rules are slightly different for non-FMLA leave. The employer is not required to continue benefits for the employee during non-FMLA leave. So the employer can say to the employee, you're going out on non-FMLA leave. Our policy is that you are no longer eligible for benefits for group health, for the group health benefits, so your benefits are going to terminate. And if that's the case, in a couple slides later, we're going to talk about the potential COBRA consequences, but the employer is not required to continue benefits during non-FMLA leave. Of course, the employer may elect to allow continuation for the employee. So even though the employer could terminate benefits, the employer policy may be to allow the employee to choose whether or not they want to continue benefits similar to FMLA leave during non-FMLA leave. So that even though the employer could drop benefits unilaterally, they can also allow the employee the opportunity to continue benefits during non-FMLA leave. Once we sort of categorize the types of leaves and once we determine that benefits are in fact going to continue during leave, the next question becomes, how is the employee going to pay their portion of benefits during the leave of absence? Employees are generally paying their portion of premiums when they are active from salary reductions. So if they go on unpaid leave, how are they going to provide their premiums to the employer to pay for their portion of premiums during leave? And there are a couple options here. The first is that the employer can give the employee the opportunity to, and the employee can pay for the premiums before leave with pre-tax dollars or post-tax dollars as well. But if the employee wants, they could say, I'm going on leave, I want to have my next 2 months of premiums deducted from my last paycheck in order to pay for my coverage for the next 2 months. So pre-tax payment before leave is one potential option that any employee has. Now, this is an option that the employer can give to the employee, but this pay before leave is not an option that the employer can mandate to the employee. The employer must also give one of the other two options to the employee. The second potential payment option is essentially pay as you go with post-tax dollars. And this is generally the most common method. It's basically continuing the same payment schedule as usual, except the employee doesn't have salary, so they're not providing salary reductions. They're essentially using their savings or income from another source to pay premiums to the employer for coverage during that period. So during the first month of leave, they might pay the premiums on the 1st of June, and then if they're out on leave in August, they would pay the premiums again on the 1st of August, this sort of pay-as-you-go method. Generally, this is the most common method of payment for premiums during leave that we see. And then finally, one last option is that the employer can allow the employee to continue coverage and pay for coverage for the employee during leave, and then recoup the premiums from the employee when they do in fact return from leave. So that is another option, probably not the most common option, but it is an option for the employer to pay for benefits and then the employee to provide the premiums when they return to leave to make up for the premiums that the employer paid for. I think the key here is that, as you can see, there are options. There is employer and employee flexibility in terms of how to pay for premiums during leave of absence, but it's important to note that some of these options are only available at the beginning of the leave or in the middle of the leave. So if this issue is not addressed at the beginning, then potentially the option and the employer and employee are left with fewer options in terms of premium payment. After we determine whether benefits are going to continue and determine how the premiums are going to be paid, there's just a couple other considerations to think about. The first is what happens upon return from leave. So we talked about how the employee can invoke a qualifying event when they leave and drop coverage, but when they return from coverage, again, there's another qualifying event which would allow them to, again, accept coverage and add coverage back that they have dropped. I think it's important to note that if coverage is continued through leave, then there is not a qualifying event when the individual returns from leave. So if coverage continues through leave, the employee does not have an option to drop coverage once or add coverage once they return from leave. But if the employee drops coverage at the beginning of leave, there's a qualifying event upon return that would allow them to add coverage back since they are, again, active employees eligible for the plan. There are also termination considerations, especially COBRA or state continuation. An employee that goes on non-FMLA leave and has their coverage terminated unilaterally by the employer could be eligible for COBRA if the employer is subject to COBRA, or potentially state continuation if they're eligible for state continuation. So if there's a unilateral dropping of coverage by the employer, meaning the employee is no longer eligible upon going on leave, then potentially that's a loss of coverage that triggers COBRA for the employee. So potentially, if coverage is lost, the employer may need to offer COBRA to that employee for that loss. Another common scenario where this happens is benefits do in fact continue on during FMLA leave, but at the end of FMLA leave, the employee doesn't return to work. And so now they are no longer eligible for benefits. Potentially there is a COBRA qualifying event there when they don't return from leave and they are terminated or no longer eligible for benefits. So termination considerations is another thing to think about. Next, FSA elections. FSAs are generally treated the same as other benefits during leave, so the same options are available for FSAs. The one unique aspect about FSAs is sort of the correlation between the contributions and the maximum coverage amount. So if an employee elects not to continue FSA elections during leave, then obviously that means those contributions aren't going to be provided to the employer, and that could potentially have an effect on the maximum coverage amount under the health FSA. I think the first thing to note is that if coverage is dropped during leave, if FSA coverage is dropped during leave, then expenses incurred during leave are not reimbursable, even if the employee picks up coverage upon return from leave. So anytime coverage is dropped, expenses incurred during that period that coverage was dropped are not reimbursable. Upon someone who drops FSA coverage upon return from leave has two options. First, they can resume the prior level of coverage, so they can essentially make up those missed contributions and have the same coverage level as they elected at the beginning. Again, expenses incurred while coverage was dropped are not eligible, but they would have the same maximum FSA coverage amount that they elected at the beginning. So they can make up their contributions is one option. The other option is to essentially continue the pro rata contribution. So if their contributions was $100 per month prior to leave, they could just pick up that $100 per month going forward after leave and not make up the missed contributions. And essentially what that does is lower their FSA coverage amount. So those are the two options for employees returning from leave for their FSA elections. And then finally, just to wrap up sort of this basic presentation of leaves of absences and benefits, I wanted to talk about a couple best practices. I think the first best practice is to address this issue prior to leave. I can't tell you how many questions we get that are something along the lines of, we had an employee that went out on leave 4 weeks ago, how are we supposed to handle benefits? And it's good that they eventually thought about this, but it's, as we talk about, it significantly reduces their options available to the employer and to the employee if this is not being addressed at the beginning of leave. So I think at a minimum, discussing this issue with the employee before leave, getting on the same page in terms of expectations about, are benefits going to be continued, who's going to be paying, that's the biggest thing. And if you don't learn anything else from this presentation other than that, I think that that's the most important thing, is address this issue prior to leave. Second best practice is, I think it's important to have a policy and have it in writing. Keep it with your important benefits documents in your files with your important benefits documents, and also provide it to the employees that are going out on leave so that they see in writing what the expectations are. And also it's important to apply the policy consistently among all your employees that are similarly situated. So don't treat one employee that's any different than another employee that's in the same situation. And then I think finally the last best practice is I think you also want to coordinate your leave policies potentially with the carriers and what your plan allows. For example, you may understand that your employee going out on leave is in a difficult situation, and you may want to be generous and allow them to continue on the group health plan indefinitely while they're on leave. Well, you want to make sure that the carrier will actually cover them in that scenario. So you just want to coordinate your policy with the carriers, and if you have any questions about whether the carrier is actually going to cover someone during leave, don't hesitate to look at the carrier documents provided or ask them questions about whether they think someone will be covered, because you don't want to be left telling an employee that they are covered for a particular period of time when the carrier is not going to do so, and potentially then you as the employer would be left on the hook for covering that individual. So I think that's, it took a little more than 15 minutes, but I think that is the basics of leaves of absence and employee benefits. Again, just as a summary, first you want to decide whether benefits are going to continue, then you want to determine how benefits are going to be paid during leave, and then finally just think of some other potential considerations that we talked about today, and go ahead and address this issue before leave so that everyone is on the same page. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up the presentation. As with all our other topics, we do have compliance support related to this issue, and we do have a reference document that we can provide and is available upon request. In the interest of time, I don't think we're going to take any questions, but my email is christopher@probenefits.com. In the future, if you have any questions on this topic or any other issue, feel free to email me. Again, christopher@probenefits.com. And finally, again, next February 16th is our next webinar, the basics of health HSA savings accounts for employers. So look for a formal invitation on that presentation. Well, thanks for joining us, and everyone have a good day today.